I'm Casper. I'm a curator of art spaces in occupied or squatted space. And this is my story. I grew up in London actually, and I had a good childhood. I was really into video games. Wasn't super social, wasn't super like active, and that sort of like was the same until I was about 15. And my dad, at one point, he got a permanent job, and that was really exciting because it was a lot less stressful. And then after that, they were like, okay, we want you to transfer to America. And so, wanting to keep the job, he transferred over there. I felt like it was, not very nice to be over there by yourself, so I moved over there as well. So I ended up going to a high school in America. Then I started discovering, music scenes and art scenes, and becoming more and more social, going to New York and experiencing like alternative culture. And also getting a little bit more politicized. It was the Iraq War was going on, and I thought that was pretty, it was pretty prevalent in American culture, and I didn't like what it was doing to sort of the way people were thinking about other countries and thinking about themselves and thinking about what young people should be doing. And as a part of, trying to go to school and trying to work jobs and trying to pay my rent, I started experimenting with living in different sort of situations. So I wasn't squatting at this point. Squatting in the US is illegal and really sort of penalized in all sorts of ways. But people always find ways to do things creatively. So we were doing things like renting out warehouse spaces and then building little subdivisions and living in sort of this like collective space. So then, eventually I graduated from university. I was at a point where I didn't really know what to do with myself. But I wanted to try and do something more adventurous and move to a different place. And I managed to get like a partial scholarship in a university here, but I wasn't covering my living expenses. So one of the things I was studying was graphic design. So I'm a graphic designer, and that's what never really considered myself an artist. But I was interested in doing graphic design, not just for corporations and brands, but for like political projects and activist projects. So I had some friends that were squatting, and they asked me to do a flyer for them, and they really liked it. And they put it, this was weird, they put it in a frame in the like social center, and I never had anything I'd done framed before, so that was really nice. And that made me obviously want to do more stuff with them, and also experiment with using the sort of spaces that were open to experiment with other forms of art. Currently, I'm not living in a squat. I kind of got a little bit stressed out and moved up to London. I love Brighton, but it can get stressful sometimes. And so, but now I'm back visiting. My friends are looking for a new place, so I'm gonna go check out some places around here. Looking for a new squat involves finding a derelict building, a building that's obviously not being cared for, obviously not being put into some kind of use currently or in the past few years. So this building was the Autonomous Homeless Shelter, which was a sort of project set up by squatters to deal with homelessness. It was basically run as sort of a project. One of the big homeless shelters in Hove was being shut down. Now the space is empty. It's not a sort of space that anyone would want to live in. It's pretty damp, but it was keeping a lot of people out of the cold. And so, it's really shocking that not only would they not provide services, but they would stop other people from providing shelter for the most vulnerable people. And it really kind of makes me angry because Mike Weatherly recently said that homelessness has nothing to do with squatting,
but they're clearly linked, and they're clearly, it's clearly a case of squatters are looking out for homeless people, and homeless people are squatters.
In New York, people know about squatting, but they see it as almost like a historical thing that happened a few decades ago. Whereas here it is actually like alive and well. It's underneath the radar some of the time, but I was lucky enough to discover it firstly through the Occupy camp. I was working at a sort of tent city in Brighton, and some people came by and did a workshop. And then later I ran into a friend I made there, and they invited me to a show, and it was a sort of really nice folk show in a squat. And from there I started meeting people and getting invited to other sort of events that were going on. But another way I actually got interested in squatting and met a lot of people was playing the games of Capture the Flag in the sort of Brighton streets. And it was nuts because what you had was regular people, students going to clubs and going to pubs, and then us doing something completely different and running through the streets and having a much better time and spending no money and getting to know people in a situation that wasn't the sort of like bland, sort of overhyped club experience where you don't really meet anyone and you only are social because you're drinking a lot.
This is the London Road Co-op. They've been trying to do something with it for a decade now, I think. And they're talking about turning it into a new town hall, but we took it over for the squatters convergence, and we basically had like the population of a small town living in there, and basically doing workshops and stuff like that. One of the cool things about commercial properties is they tend to be bigger, so you get more of a community, but then they can be really hard to manage. Like that building, it's possible to get lost in there for days.
Generally, when you're squatting, you have a crew, which is a group of friends or acquaintances or people you know that you are happy to live with, and you'll try and gain entry with people, and normally what will happen is there's just a window open, and it'll involve some climbing and some sort of aerobatics. But generally, I mean, there is this sort of perception that there are like party squats and there are political squats, but I think that's kind of like a myth, because really, nobody just squats to party. They're all there's a sort of element of you're trying to do something and you're rejecting a certain system or a certain prescribed role, and vice versa. Nobody is interested in doing all politics 1000% of the time. There's an element of sociality and cultural sort of interchange that happens. The art collective basically came about when I ran into one of my friends from the Occupy Brighton camp, and we had talked about living together and finding a squat, but for whatever reason it didn't really work out. And then I ran into him again a few months later, and I was on my way to help my friends build like barricades because they were worried about being illegally evicted. So I invited him to come, and he had his camera with him, and he was showing everyone like his photography, and I was like, this is great, we should show this, because this was actually the first time he'd shown it to anyone in a long time. He wasn't that into the idea, but he realized eventually he does have a lot of talent as a photographer, and so the International Squatters Convergence was coming up in Brighton, and we sort of informally talked, me and some people from like the Squatters Network of Brighton, about doing some sort of art space, like a TAA, but on a smaller scale, like a sort of arts festival in the basement. And we weren't actually going to do it. We decided it was too much work. But then once we saw the space, we were like, this is amazing. We've got to do something with it. So myself and a lot of other people ended up getting involved in making the space really amazing. And it was a really great experience, not just, when the gallery was open, but also setting up the gallery and exploring and getting materials and, all the things that go into producing art. what we're doing with Squatted Spaces is political because we're kind of very outgoing about what we do, and we're not trying to act like the media portrays us as sort of like criminals shifting around, being really secretive, or as party kids partying all the time. We're actually trying to do something really creative, and I think there's a political component to any piece of art, and there's also a political component to the way that you show art. Our activism or engagement is sort of targeting two groups of people. One are sort of like artists and cultural workers and, you know, precarious young people who maybe aren't squatters, right? But who are sympathetic, and they might want to come see, you know, the galleries that we open or come to the games that we play or things like that. On the other hand, it's maybe like targeting squatters too, and I think there's a tendency for us to be very withdrawn, and I think it's partly is because of the way the media portrays us. We think everyone hates us, so we're not very friendly, but it's to try and encourage us to, like, you know, reach out and show people what we are actually doing, like that we're not terrible people, that we, you know, are creative people, that we're friendly, that we're doing a lot of things for the community that people don't even realize. So as well as, you know, obviously living collaboratively and collectively and, you know, democratically to the extent that we can, there's also things like, you know, recycling or reusing sort of thrown away food, a practice called skipping, where people go through dumpsters outside of supermarkets and get food that people are just going to throw away. And I mean, I think a lot of us are taught as kids not to waste food, but then we do it every day on a sort of corporate scale. So we go through and some of the best meals I've ever had have been, you know, skipped food. Then there's also things like, you know, there's a vegetable distributor that was on St. James Place in Brighton that wasn't skip food because we realized people have different, you know, cultural sensitivities and maybe wouldn't want to eat skip food. So we were getting food from a wholesale vegetable distributor and sort of doing a donation-based distribution system as a way of sort of critiquing the way that like big chain supermarkets had like infringed on local providers. And then there are things like social centers, education projects, English teaching or watching people's kids. Bike repair is a big thing, you know, venue, shows, concerts, theater, fashion, things like that. And I think that's really important, that you give young people a space to, like, you know, do work in and do creative things in. I'd been like trying to finish a major project I was working on because I was a student at the time as well as a squatter. And I come back and wanted to take a nap, and my friends were like, "That's great, you can watch the place while we're out, do this thing called squat sitting," which is, you know, where you look after a space while people are gone. I really didn't want to do that, but I was like, okay, and they're like, "Don't worry about it, we'll be back in half an hour, then you can leave." So yeah, after about 20 minutes I get woken up and I'm like, oh, it's my friends, and it turned out to be 4, you know, suited up police officers that wanted to ask me about the people above. Because we had like an interesting situation where we had a commercial building and a residential flat above it, and there were people upstairs in the residential flat. They weren't living there, but you know, police wanted them out and they didn't want to leave, and they saw sort of what they were doing as a sort of form of civil disobedience, which I thought was really cool. So they actually glued themselves together in the attic. And I was sort of frantically trying to contact people. So within an hour we had like 20 or 30 people outside, and then more people coming by every few minutes. Yeah, so also some of my other friends managed to sneak up and climb somehow onto the roof, and so they were on the roof and, you know, making a bigger spectacle. People across the street dropped a banner in support, like students. They were renting, they weren't squatters. There were people who were passing by were just you know, heckling the police. But I had to break down the door, which took 10 minutes. and then drag people out. And it was really embarrassing for the police, and obviously not what they wanted to be doing. But because we wanted to keep the space secure while this was happening, I had to stay there and was basically like barricaded in by myself for 10 hours. Some friends and I, there's a running joke that I don't like to call squatting squatting. I like to call it conceptual architecture, because it's a way of reusing space that is not being used. And as a joke, I also made my friends take me to this architecture sort of talk festival thing that was going on in the basement, the car park of a hotel in Brighton. And so we get there as the gallery was closing. We're not your typical gallery crowd. But I was really interested in what they were doing, and it was some students and some architectural practitioners. So then when I was looking at the schedule, I see Mr. Robert Nemeth is speaking, and he's pretty notorious actually as a sort of lifestyle and architecture critic for the latest Homes magazine in Brighton, and he's done some really nasty things where he's basically taken photos of squats after they've been evicted that are very staged and try to show that squatters are terrible people. So and he's also refused, him and Mr. Weatherly, who's the MP responsible for squatting, who he works for, they both refused to have any kind of debate or even acknowledge us as people or political with political rights. So yeah, I basically decided that I wanted to confront him and have some friends confront him. So I arranged, we made flyers and we arranged to be there. It was a really nice experience because he was not expecting it at all. He probably hadn't spoken in public a lot, and he thought that this was going to be something that he could actually boast about being responsible for the new squatting laws, which he did, right? But then halfway through the talk, he said a line that I thought was really interesting. That was, bad architecture leads to riots, insurrection, and war. And in a sense, that's true. Bad architecture does lead to that, but bad architecture is architecture that's not being used, not aesthetically or unpretty architecture. So yeah, anyway, I decided to go up, and there was some confrontation and some glitter allegedly got thrown somewhere. Then after that, I sat back down, and in the Q&A, the entire audience harassed him about his change, because architects don't want to build buildings that are going to lie empty. There's a huge social responsibility inherent in architecture as well as in art, and any true architect realizes that. So I'd been evicted, which was one day, it happens occasionally, but been evicted, and then I spent the whole day in court supporting a friend who'd been arrested for a civil disobedience action, and it was really stressful watching the court proceedings. And then I finally get home, I'm finally about to relax, and I get a call from the police, and it's a detective saying that they wanted to investigate me based on charges of assault. So yeah, it's been really stressful. The police have been, sympathetic, and they're just doing their job. The court system, the same. But I think, it just shows how petty and vindictive some of the people responsible for this bill are, that they can't even handle any kind of criticism.
We're here at the University of Sussex campus, and Mike Weatherly, who's one of the main architects of the squatting ban, is meant to be speaking here and justifying the new law. And so a lot of my friends who've been directly influenced by it are here to let him know what they think about the law. So yeah. Art is really important for us, because it's maybe the only resource that we actually have in abundance. They have more money, they have more political power, they have more social standing than we do, but we have a lot more creativity, and I think it's really hard for people to fail to see and to be captivated by that when they witness the sort of squatting community. So getting my friends, my community to be more outspoken and proud of the sort of stuff that we create is really important for me. It's really easy to simplify the enemies to people like Mike Weatherly, the MP who's banned squatting, or his staff, or the homeowners who are responsible for, you know, passing the law, or landlords associations. But really, I think it's a problem that we have as of a society as a whole, where we're not, you know, it used to be that people would welcome strangers into their homes. They would, you know, look out for their neighbors. They would, and I mean, I know that it's not, that's maybe painting a rosy picture of the past, but I feel like there is a sort of level of solidarity that's been completely eroded, and a lot of people are, you know, without any kind of support structure. What we do started as a form of resistance just to sort of the lack of creativity in our lives. We were working boring jobs. We were like struggling, you know, to like even, you know, have a place to live. And then it became like, well, while we have the space, even if we only have it for a few weeks, let's do something with it, and let's really make it our own in a way that, you know, having a title deed doesn't, because, you know, if you actually turn it into a home rather than a house. But I think squatting isn't a long-term solution to homelessness, and I don't think we're arguing that it is. I don't think anyone is. But I think talking about long-term solutions, those same people that are responsible for banning squatting are also responsible for making sure that no affordable housing is built, because it's sort of advantageous for people to be precarious. They're willing to do a lot more. They're willing to have a lot less scruples about who they screw over and how they live if they're scared. And I think in a lot of ways, we've really moved towards a sort of climate of fear and anxiety. And I think that while squatting, you know, has its anxieties, it maybe has less anxiety than, you know, a lot of lives that other people lead. We don't need to worry about, you know, where we're going to get money to pay rent. We don't need to necessarily worry about, you know, going long distances to find somebody who will have our back.
I mean, I think everyone goes through moments. It's like, it is kind of a depressing lifestyle, and I think you know, ask why, like, squatters, why don't they have jobs, or like, you know, why aren't they, you know, more involved in their community, or what, sort of like it, after being told, like, you know, you're worthless, you know, you're useless, you know, you're a criminal, it does get people down. So everyone I've met who's been a squatter has dealt with moments of depression, moments of, you know, anxiety. But I think also, you know, the good thing is you don't have to deal with that by yourself. There's always other people around you that have been through the same thing, or maybe going through the same thing. And so, you know, it's a really supportive community. And I think, you know, I've met people that are, you know, have been squatters and they moved out and they've now renting a place, or they, you know, they've even a homeowner, but they still like support squatting. They still support, you know, the community, because it's not just about like finding a place to live. It's about how we live in that space and how we inhabit that space, and how we relate to each other.